well, thank you all so much for joining us this morning for the Origins of Museums, Cabinets of Curiosity with Mary Woodward. Ever wonder how museums began? In the 16th and 17th centuries, wealthy European collectors began to gather their treasures into special rooms or even cabinets to display them. There was a wide range of marvelous objects gathered, and depending on the collector's taste, art, mechanical devices, wonders of the natural world, the rarer the item, the better. Sometimes these wonder chambers were used to teach the public, but many were simply used to impress. Let's have a look at these special spaces that have evolved in the past and have a look at the way modern museums are recreating them. Let's see here. Those include Boston's Museum of Fine Arts, Houston's Museum of Fine Arts, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. So Mary Woodward is an art historian who serves as a guide at several historic New England properties. She previously served as public programs coordinator and educator at the Concord Museum. Mary has a BA in art history from Furman University and an MA in art history from Emory University. She has 40 plus years of experience in museums of all shapes and sizes, from the comprehensive collection at the Cleveland Museum of Art to the one-room log cabin birthplace of President James Polk. So again, want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library and the Memorial Hall Library for co-sponsoring this morning's program. And all 51 of us, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Mary for joining us here this morning. And Mary, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert, very much for the kind invitation to talk again to the audience, well beyond Tewksbury and Andover, it sounds like. So I'm really pleased to be with you all today. Our presentation today explores, as he said, the history of the Wunderkammer, the Cabinet of Curiosities. We'll learn who made them, when and why, and we will explore how they influenced and became some of the modern museums of today. The word Kunstkammer, meaning art chamber, appeared in Germany around 1550, to be joined very soon after by the word Wunderkammer, which meant wondrous chamber. And in no time, the two terms merged to form the phrase Kunst- und Wunderkammer. In England, they became known as cabinets of curiosities. The word cabinet or kammer originally referred to the entire room, like the words chamber or in French, chambre. But eventually the cabinets actually do contain, the rooms contain cabinets the way we know them, pieces of furniture with drawers and bins and cupboards for the storage and display of things. These collections could seem like a cross between a natural history collection, a botanical museum, an art museum with a touch of Ripley's Believe It or Not thrown in. Generally speaking, most of the collections contained materials classified this way. Naturalia. Those were specimens from the natural world, such as stuffed animals, pressed plants, shells, sea creatures, and especially coral. They loved coral. Another category was artificialia, things that humans made out of those natural materials. And in that category, then, we would find art as we know it, paintings, sculptures, ceramics. The third category, scientifica, instruments, tools for industry, things like medical tools, astronomical devices like globes, mechanical devices like clocks, and automatons. We'll see about those in a little bit. And then the fourth category we have to put down as exotica, sort of anything else, everything else, and perhaps something from an unknown land or something that has like a misshapen pearl or a strange looking tree root or anything else that would catch their eye. Now, not every collector gathered the same types of objects or for the same purposes, as we will discover. Who were these collectors? They were curious people. They could be merchants who traveled the world or traded with goods from around the world. They could be gardeners whose main interests were owning plants from exotic locations, which, by the way, was a very profitable business. These people could be apothecaries, or we would call them pharmacists, who used their collections to create medicines. Professors who used their collections to teach from. And the aristocracy, who amassed their collections on grand scales, usually, as a means of enjoying the spoils of their wealth while competing against one another for the really best things. Besides being curious, you could say that these collectors were driven by a desire to learn, to categorize and understand more of the world around them. Much like our museums today, Wunderkammern were intended to deepen people's knowledge through the presentation of objects. Now, for some collectors, there was kind of a mystical pursuit driving their collection. I think some of them must have thought that once they had collected everything, some great truth would be revealed. And I bet if you talk to collectors today, or if you are a collector yourself of something, you might feel a little bit of that yourself. Some collectors still do. So how did this practice of collecting get started? Well, of course, actually, it's quite old. Humans have always collected things, first as a means of survival, and then pretty quickly for aesthetic reasons, for reasons that pleased us. Now, back in Alexandria, Virginia, Egypt, in the 4th century BCE, there was a museum alongside the famous Library of Alexandria. And a museum takes its name because it's a temple devoted to the Muses. And the Muses were those mythological goddesses who inspired literature, culture, and the arts. But the museum in Alexandria, Egypt, all those centuries ago, didn't have an art collection of its own that we're aware of, but instead was more of a place of learning about those objects. Now, what prompted then the creation of the cabinets of curiosities during the period that we're discussing, from the 1470s or so to the 1770s? In part, in very large part, it was due to the Renaissance, because then in Western Europe, societies were becoming more interested in learning about the past as well as the world around them. And it was also a time period of burgeoning international travel. The New World and Asia were areas where they were full of plants and animals and peoples that Europeans were just beginning to discover. So besides hearing about and visiting one another's cabinets of curiosities, there was some practical advice for collectors in the form of a book. In 1565, a Belgian doctor named Samuel Quitcheberg published a book, which is considered really the first museum publication. He presented ideas for setting up a collection. He suggested, and this was very important, a detailed classification system. He put that out there. And he also had some practical instructions for collectors. He gave very specific advice about how to store and display your collection, no matter what it was. And he said, one of his points was, it's all right to use boxes, but you've got to be sure that they're labeled well. And I have to tell you, museum storage, nearly 500 years on from Quitcheberg's book, is still a problem area for many museums, and labeling those boxes clearly is also still a problem. As we peek into these cabinets of curiosities from centuries ago, we'll also learn how some of them became the foundations of the modern museums we know today. In fact, there are practices and policies and problems that were first encountered hundreds of years ago in these cabinets that still affect museums today. And storage is just one of those. We'll start in Renaissance Italy, where we begin to see the creation of spaces specifically set aside for the study and the gathering of these collections. They called them studiolos. And there the collector might gather a few friends together to see his display of objects and hope that they would not only be enlightened, but also very impressed by his things. Happily, we don't have to go as far as Italy to see one. There is a studiolo that is close to us. This room was created for the Duke Federico de Montefeltro, who was described by a contemporary as, and I quote, being ever careful to learn something new every day. The room, as you can see, is now located at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was made entirely of inlaid wood, different colors of wood, in a technique called intarsia. And it's a trompe l'oeil effect, a fool the eye effect, very convincing three-dimensional look achieved to these, I promise you, very flat panels of wood in the room. It was a small room, about 12 by 16 feet. The cabinet doors might feature, as you can see here, open books, for instance, or musical instruments on the flat panel outside, and then you would open this cabinet door and might actually find musical instruments on the inside. It's a quiet, contemplative retreat, and it's there, as I say, at the Metropolitan Museum. They don't open the doors for you. You can't see in, but it's a very, very beautiful space. Now, I mentioned he as being the Duke, but you know, it wasn't just full of the practice wasn't just man caves. Let me introduce you to Isabella d'Este. She created a famous chamber of her own in the palace at Mantua. Isabella d'Este was a leading aristocratic woman of the Italian Renaissance, and she was well educated. She collected Roman antiquities. She studied history. She studied architecture and industry. Her collections were wide-ranging and contained magnificent examples of gems, gemstones, of clocks, and other works of art, rarities as well. As patroness of the arts, she employed the best-known artists of the day, Michelangelo, Raphael, oh, and this fellow, Leonardo. Now look at this portrait of Isabella. It's a chalk drawing by Leonardo. Does she look somewhat familiar to you? Well, there are some people who believe she is the person featured in the Mona Lisa painting. There are letters that exist between Isabella and Leonardo discussing a portrait that he was painting of her. And just down here in this lower section, it's a virtual reconstruction of her original studiolo. It's been taken apart years and years and years ago, hundreds of years ago. But by putting the paintings that they know were in there back into this computer-generated view, we get some sense of what Isabella's studiolo was like. Now let's stay in Italy for a minute longer and have a look. We'll pay a visit to Ferrante Imperato in Naples. He was an apothecary or pharmacist, as I said. He collected minerals, fossils, and shells in his cabinet. But of course, our eye is drawn to the stuffed crocodile hanging from the ceiling. More importantly, though, Imperato collected specimens for study and for use in preparation of medicines. One author describes his cabinet of curiosities as forming a functional combination of both a cabinet of curiosity and a scientific laboratory. Imperato and his son, who followed him, used their collection to make medicines, investigate the natural world, and teach other people. Imperato published one volume of his research called Natural History in 1599, and he used this image that you see here of his cabinet at the front of his book, making it the earliest illustration of such a cabinet of curiosities. And in the print now, I want to draw your attention, so I will with this. We believe this is probably his son, hat in hand, And look, he's holding a long stick here, pointing to these visitors who've come to the cabinet. We think this is most likely Imperato, the father himself, standing here as they admire what he has collected. He and his son had a special interest in the purported healing powers of stones. For instance, in his book, an amethyst, for example, they suggest when worn on the navel, frees a person of intoxication. Who knew? This and other helpful, healthy hints were found in a publication that his son produced about 10 years later. Imperato, the father's motto that he included in his 1599 book was this: I improve from day to day. Now, again, we can see that motivation behind this cabinet of curiosity to seek, to learn, and to improve. Now, since we're learning how Wunderkammer became museums, here's an image of a modern museum that has turned itself back into a Wunderkammer, deliberately copying the exhibit of Imperato's museum just for a recent special exhibition. Now, the other category of collectors were the aristocracy, and let's face it, they had bigger budgets when it came to collecting for their cabinets. And one of the greatest was brought together by the Habsburg Archduke Ferdinand at Ambras Castle in Innsbruck, Austria. In 1573, he designated one building to house his collection. And remarkably, most of the collection is still there in place, giving Ambras Castle its claim to fame, which is the only Renaissance Kunst im Wunderkammer that's still in its original location. Ferdinand displayed things primarily by the material that they were made from. So for instance, in the blue case, you might have objects made from gold, and in the green case, objects from silver. This is an image from a relatively recent reinstallation of his collection. Now let's look at a few of the amazing things that Archduke Ferdinand had in his collection. This is one of the world's most famous pieces of tableware, and it was once part of his collection at Ambras Castle. It's the Salt Cellar by Benvenuto Cellini. It was created in 1543 for the King of France, who gave it as a gift to the Habsburgs. It's made of gold and ivory and enamel, and it features a Neptune-like figure, as you see there, with salt would go in the small bowl next to him, and a sea-like nymph lady adjoining him, and the pepper pot is this beautiful little building right here. Let's look at another. What a magnificent thing to have on your desk for keeping your ink and your pens safely set aside. This is a beautiful silver writing box by a craftsman named Wenzel Jamnitzer, and you can see made about 1570 for Ferdinand. What Jamnitzer did was he took living subjects like the frogs and the beetles and the little tiny crawfish and things like this, and he cast them in silver and decorated this beautiful box. This way, those little creatures are preserved forever. And from Ferdinand's collection of Scientifica comes an automaton. It's a machine that moves on its own in a natural way. This musical gondola moves on little hidden wheels. As it moves, the gondolier can change the direction right here with the rudder. The lady will sing and the man can raise his hands. It was meant to amaze and amuse the guests who sat at the table with this little piece moving down the table in front of them. Today, visitors to Ambras Castle can see Ferdinand's collection, but we can't experience it the way his guests did. His guests were allowed to touch and feel and taste and smell the objects that he collected in his cabinet. Now, after his death, Ferdinand's death, death, his whole collection passed to his nephew, who was Emperor Rudolph II. And happily for all of us, Emperor Rudolph left the collection in almost its entirety at Ambras Castle. And why? Well, because he had a collection of his own at his own castle. Emperor Rudolph is, by scholars' accounts, the person who amassed the most encyclopedic Kunst und Wunderkammer of all. As one author says, nothing was outside his scope of interests, and his resources, meaning his money, was virtually limitless. Here's a terrific portrait, an allegorical portrait of him, because among the artists that were closely associated with Rudolph was this artist, Giuseppe Arcimboldo, who's famous for these colorful and allegorical portraits. Here is a portrait of Archduke Rudolph as the personification of Vertumnus, the god of vegetation and of spring. And here's another one from the collection. This was his father, Emperor Maximilian, in the personification of fire. And you see all kinds of elements that were used to make fire, from a little oil lamp here to a cannon here, and muskets or guns here, and sort of a flaming array of sticks, if you would, burning in his hair. Quite a magnificent and unusual portrait, you could say. Now here, let's look at a few other things that Rudolph collected for his cabinet. Here is a lidded cup by Nicholas Flaff. It's made of the tusks of a warthog, as you see here, sitting on top here, and it's got some pretty powerful imagery here, if you would say. According to the museum's description, the huge tusks of a warthog come out to either side like the horns of this fantastical creature here. And if that creature isn't scary enough in its present form, originally it had a fossilized shark's tooth. If you've ever got those on the beach, you know, their long, jagged teeth, that would have been protruding from this. So imagine sitting at your table, the emperor is hoping to impress you, and this is sitting as a cup at your space. He also was interested in scientifica, and clocks were among Rudolph's favorite pieces in his collection. He had a lot of timepieces, a lot of astronomical instruments. This is a dazzling celestial clock that you see here, which is now with the collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. One author says that Rudolph had a desk in his Kunst und Wunderkammer, and he spent time studying and enjoying what he had collected. It wasn't open for the general public, but interestingly, he made it available and open for his court artists for their inspiration. One author says, for the emperor himself, this collection must have seemed like the source of unceasing joy. It was like a kingdom of his that never failed to disappoint him. So he gathered things around him that gave him great joy. Now we'll turn to a different type of cabinet, a literal cabinet, if you will, the way we think of a cabinet. In the early 1600s, living in Augsburg, Germany, Philipp Hainhofer was a merchant of luxury goods that collectors, like the Archduke and emperors, wanted. Traveling merchants came to sell to Hainhofer, and royal patrons came to buy from him. He's quoted as saying, when someone presents me with a foreign object for my Kunstkammer, whether it be artificialia or naturalia, I experience more joy than if he had given me cash. Hainhofer was familiar with some of the famous collections or cabinets of curiosities in Europe. He'd actually visited Archduke Ferdinand's at Ambras Castle. Hainhofer was famous for these actual wooden cabinet constructions that he made, filling them, and they were multi-purpose pieces of furniture, as we'll see in just a few more slides, containing drawers, cabinets, and more. And apparently he made them first and then sought them for, patrons to buy them, royal patrons, wealthy patrons, and collectors to buy them. And this painting here, while it's not that cabinet on the left that you see there, but you see a cabinet here being presented in a court. Here are the people, there's she and he, these must be the aristocracy or the royalty who have gotten this beautiful cabinet. And look at what a social event it is, that they have brought this beautiful thing here, opened the drawers, started pulling things out, and this is the beautiful display. Now, if we focus our attention here on this side, we do see an actual cabinet that he created, really considered his most magnificent work. It was a gift for the King of Sweden, who visited Augsburg, who visited Hainhofer. And Hainhofer was personally able to show off all the features of this cabinet, and there are simply so many to count. It contains more than 1,000 objects that probably took him decades to gather. Samples of precious gems and minerals. You see coral being carved here and cameos here. It contained samples of instruments and real instruments like like razor blades and scissors over here on this side. It also contained a musical instrument, and the yellow arrow here is pointing to a virginal, a small keyboard that could be played where it was in place, or it could be set to play automatically when the cabinet doors open, like an old-fashioned music box that you might have had, where you lifted the lid and it played music. At the very top of the whole wondrous feast of things he's collected in this cabinet was this very large actual Seychelles nut, an actual native, natural piece of nut that's been encased in coral and gold and silver. But you can see a handle here and a spout at this end, and that whole contraption on top could be removed and used as a wine pitcher to further impress your guests. Now, if it wasn't enough that the cabinet was filled with these wonderful treasures from the natural world or the artificial treasures of art in it, it was also filled with games and practical jokes, things like little panels of wavy mirrors like we used to see at the funhouse, or gloves, for instance, that the fingers are sewn together so you can't actually put it on. These kinds of jokes were fun for the court, for the aristocracy to have fun with and to play with. They had that sort of fun sense of humor at this time period in the 1600s. Hainhofer liked to describe his pieces and promote them by claiming that, many people, he would say, considered these the eighth wonder of the world, and they certainly are magnificent. Now, staying in Northern Europe just a little bit, Copenhagen's University had a medical professor named Ole Worm, and he built a private collection to indulge his own curiosity and from which he taught his students. Worm had actually visited Imperato's collection in Naples, so that drawing looks familiar, or the print looks familiar to this one. He was familiar with other cabinets, like the one at Ambrose Castle, for instance, through the catalogs that would be produced. Ole Worm built his collection for more than 2 decades, and his last great achievement was the publication in 1655 of his book called Museum Wormianum. It really, says one author, secured his name as the founder of not just Danish museums, but European museums. The book is actually in 4 volumes, and it contains very accurate descriptions and illustrations of his collection. It's truly a scientific work. Now, we're going to venture across the water a tiny bit to get to England, where we will meet John Tradescant the Elder. He was a gardener who worked for the nobility. often sent off on buying missions to source the most beautiful, exotic, and rare plants. From England, he traveled to Europe, to Russia, and to North Africa on these buying trips. And the thing about him was he was successful at getting these rare and exotic plants to grow in England. And that was a very profitable business venture for his employers. On these trips, he collected specimens for his own gardens as well. And then he began to expand his collecting to include curiosities, examples of unusual and rare animals, or of birds, and of man-made objects as well. Beginning in 1643, he opened his collection and garden to the public, and he charged a sixpence to see inside. Now, I don't know what a sixpence was in 1634, but I think it was probably inexpensive admission cost. It was called the Ark, his garden and his collection, probably in reference to its all-encompassing nature. And the Ark became an internationally famous must-see destination for curious travelers to London in the 1630s. Now, even though the Ark doesn't exist and remain in place any longer, happily, we can see part of that collection, because after his death, his collection was acquired by a man named Elias Ashmole, who was his own self a wealthy collector and a founding member of the Royal Society, which was a very early scientific body for study in London. Ashmole, in turn, gave the collection to Oxford, and it became known as the Ashmolean Museum. And that made it the second oldest university museum in the world, after the one at the University of Basel, Switzerland. The original building for the Ashmolean had a chemical laboratory in it as well, and 2 libraries and a lecture hall. And that emphasizes the idea that a collection like this should be studied at a university level. A description of the Ashmolean from 1683 refers to it as a museum, and that's the earliest use of that word to refer to a collection in England. In the collection, there is a cloak belonging to the Native American king of Virginia, Powhatan, and it was part of Tradescant's original Ark collection. You can see a drawing of it here as I describe it, and then this is a photo of it laying horizontally in this large case. It's a large deer hide mantle with shell beadwork, and it dates from the very first period of contact between the indigenous peoples of America and the British colonists. It belonged to the leader of the Powhatan people, who was the father of Pocahontas as well. The mantle was in Tradescant's collection as early as 1638, but we don't know exactly how he acquired it. The most widely accepted explanation was that it may have been a gift 30 years earlier from Powhatan, intended for the English king, but got maybe a little sidetracked and stayed at the Ark instead. Now, staying in England for a bit longer, we'll meet Sir Hans Sloane, whose collection of more than 100,000 objects became the basis not only for the British Museum, but also the British Library and London's Natural History Museum. So what was in Sloane's collection? Almost everything. In large part, it consisted of his herbarium, a study collection of plants that also included corals and shells. And you can see cocoa leaves here pressed together in a book. But there were also objects that he collected from other explorers and collectors. There were archaeological things like mummies there, and ethnographic things like illuminated manuscripts there. Sir Sloane owned a copy of Ole Worm's Museum Wormianum book, and he followed his system of classification for his collection. It sounds very orderly, but one author notes that there was, and I quote, a recurrent drift towards miscellaneousness. So still a bit of a jumble if we can think of it in our minds. Now, Sloane had collections from North America, and including one from close to us, from the Massachusetts colony. It's a spoon, and here it is, the back of the spoon right here, made of bone, upon which the actual label information, or the information about how it was collected, was written out on it, either by Sloane or by someone in his museum. And you can see the date, Anno 1702, probably the date that it was received into the collection. And what is transcribed here is the body of a letter from the man who gave it to him, which was John Winthrop of Harvard, the great-great-grandson of the founder of the Massachusetts colony. So Sir Hans Sloane died in 1753, and his will made his desire clear that his museum should be free for anyone who wanted to visit. And the result was the creation of the world's first free national public museum. And in fact, the British Museum is still free to enter today. There were usual problems with these museums, even in the 18th century. Here's from their history books, we see that one visitor lodged a familiar sounding complaint. He wanted to complain that his tour group had moved too quickly through the galleries. And when he asked the guide to explain something, the guide shot back a short-tempered answer. One author says, in an effort to make the museum public, all members of society were welcome, but some were made to feel more welcome than others. Previously, of course, this had been the domain of the higher levels of society, but Sir Sloane wanted to make this museum available to everyone. I would submit to you today that that museums really around the world, but especially I think from personal experience in America, still struggle with this idea that we want to make museums feel welcoming to everyone who wants to come. Well, what about America during this period of time? John Adams, our second president, wrote a kind of complaining letter back to wife Abigail in May of 1780, telling her that he had seen cabinets of natural history and great collections of things in Paris, for instance, and he wondered why America didn't have anything since, as he wrote, and I quote from his letter, "Our country affords as ample materials for collections of this nature as any part of the world." Well, as a matter of fact, it wasn't too long before we had one. In 1786, the painter Charles Willson Peale, patriarch to an entire artistic family, opened the first natural history museum in the United States in Philadelphia. And years later, he painted a self-portrait of himself there called The Artist in his museum from 1822. It shows Peale lifting the curtains back to reveal a long room full of natural history displays. At his feet, there's a stuffed turkey. Peale taught himself the art of taxidermy, and we know the turkey was Ben Franklin's choice to be our national bird. There are also mastodon bones here at Peale's feet. And that's important because it was the first, and then a large dinosaur here, skeleton put together here. These were the first examples of mastodon bones to be put on display in America. His collection didn't stay together. Eventually, it was purchased by P.T. Barnum and dispersed, if you will. But it was a very scientific approach to collecting and displaying and teaching the public from a museum. Now, my personal interest in the topic arose from my experience at Emory University in Atlanta. When I began as a graduate student there, the university's museum was described to me as a Wunderkammer, which was a term I wasn't familiar with, but it certainly was an apt description because the place held a natural history collection, butterflies, for instance, by the thousands in display. There was a mineral collection, fossils and shells. There was an archaeological collection with mummies from Egypt. and an art collection with works by Rembrandt and Kandinsky. It looks so much like a centuries-old Wunderkammer that it was used as one in a Hollywood movie. Now, this photo here was taken a few years before I got there, but not too long. And it shows how cramped the display cases were in the museum. What I like, and the reason I've included Imperatos is, so here's this gentleman and he's doing what? He's holding a long stick and he's pointing to something in a cabinet off to the left we can't see, and everyone is rapt attention here as they're watching. But when I put that up, I realized, oh gosh, I've seen that image somewhere before. So, 400 years hadn't changed too much. Here's Imperato's son over here, right, with the long stick showing people around the collection. Well, the university's history blog describes the old cramped arrangement like this as, and I quote, giving a person the general sense of having strolled into someone's unusually desperate garage sale. Now, that was a little sad. When I finished my degree, I stayed on, and our small staff spent several years re-examining and sorting the collection. The butterflies and the mineral samples went to the nearby science center and so on. And in the process, we distilled a small but high quality collection of art and archaeology for Emory University. Now, there may be a change to switch back, though, in the air for the 21st century, as some museums pay homage to that historical cabinet of curiosity. Houston's Museum of Fine Arts has created a more orderly view of a Kunst im Wunderkammer by filling this section of their museum by displaying things in a way that we are not used to seeing them, paintings stacked upon one another. And here is a close look at the kind of varied objects that they have put on display in Houston's Museum of Fine Arts. And two of the museums that we've been talking about that grew out of the 16th and 17th century cabinets have now also reinstalled some of their collection in that way. The British Museum has opened what they call the Enlightenment galleries to show how objects were organized and displayed when it first opened to the public. And in Vienna, at the Kunsthistorisches Museum, where most of Emperor Rudolph's collection went, they have a new installation that they call the Cradle of the Museum, which I like to think is like the start of the museum. Here is how their website describes it. They say, the Kunstkammer Vienna is the most important collection of its kind in the world. Come and see a museum within a museum. 20 newly installed galleries invite you to experience a world of beauty and wit, curiosities and wonder. So the desire to study and collect and display objects of the natural, animal, and human worlds is an old one. During the 1470s to 1770s especially, that desire found its expression in some of the awe-inspiring and wondrous cabinets of curiosities that we've seen in today's talk. So here's hoping that we'll be able to follow Quicheberg's suggestion and seek out marvelous things ourselves again soon. Happy hunting. Thank you.
So Mary, wonderful job as always. I learned quite a bit. So if folks have any questions or comments for Mary, now would be the time to get those into the Q&A box and into the chat. And yeah, we can take about 10 minutes of questions if anyone has them. Yeah. And Mary, while we wait for questions and comments, what was the most interesting thing you learned while researching for this presentation?
I was fascinated with the idea that what we might from the outside first look think of were little, oddities, collections of weird and little things, that some of those are really formed the basis of the museums that we can think of today, like the British Museum, for instance, or the Kunsthistorisches in Vienna. These are world-class, world-famous museums, but they really owe their start to the kind of cabinets of curiosities that we've been looking at. And I just had no idea that they could have started from such an unusual desire, well, not unusual desire, but from such unusual starts.
Gail writes, wonderful, wonderful talk, Mary. Thank you. Mike says, excellent presentation. I learned a lot. Sally says, interesting and thorough presentation. Thank you. B writes, wonderful presentation and slides. Thank you. Nancy says, it was so great to have a grand museum tour. Mike asks, do you have any comments about the museums at Harvard?
At Harvard?
Yep.
Oh, well, I recently, I guess, well, I'll say recently, maybe a year and a half ago, was able to spend quite a bit of time in the art museums at Harvard. And, you know, and we did our color talk last time when I showed some of the color lab slides from the color lab there. What you have the opportunity at Harvard, of course, is to see the best of the best. But what Harvard represents to me, and places like some of the other university museums, is that continuing idea that big public museum is fabulous, but that higher education institutions ought to have, and happily many of them do still have, fabulous collections to teach from and to show students who may be studying all manner of topics. And Harvard's is one of the best, of course. Once you get started with getting people interested in giving, and you have core collectors who donate their pieces, and in a university setting, you have wondrous ways that you can explore those collections, and students are all the better for it, and as public that we can visit them, all the better for it as well. Yeah, we're really spoiled for riches in the Boston area with collections of all types, both university and big public collections. So as soon as those travel ban, as soon as we feel more comfortable in moving out and about in public, we should get to museums.
Tommy Lee says, thanks to Mary for a wonderful and entertaining presentation, very informative, and he thanks the Tewksbury Library for hosting the events, and he hopes for more of this in the future. More to come, Tommy, absolutely.
That's right.
Let's see, Joyce asks, what is the approximate size of the fancy salt cellar that you showed?
Great question. It's about 10 inches high. So, think of it as about the size of a sheet of paper, so tall and that wide. It's quite a fabulous piece. And as I said, it was created in France, but given to the Habsburgs as a gift. Yeah.
Teresa says, curio cabinets must be based on this idea.
Exactly. And they are. And let me just advance my slide a second. Okay, yeah, I put a few pictures in, one from somebody I follow, a shop that I follow on Instagram. He calls his shop Cabinet and Kammer, if you can see there at the top. And then this other is a picture from a shop that I love to go to in Concord, Massachusetts. But honestly, cabinets of curiosities is a kind of aesthetic that people still engage in and are inspired by. So there's some folks who like to decorate with the minimalist look, and that's cool. But there's some others of us who, the more samples of this, that, and the other, the better. But it is a contemporary aesthetic. And yes, curio cabinets exactly get their name straight from it.
So you sort of answered this. I'll ask it just so Diane hears it. So is there a direct relationship between the curio cabinets and dish cabinets in people's homes today?
Oh, absolutely. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it's obvious human desire, of course. First, a need to collect things. And when I that could be like the really sharp rock that you could use to cut things with. On a very basic human level, we first collected things that were useful to us, but very quickly on, we know that in ancient times, peoples collected things for aesthetic reasons. And that is a human interest. And so, yes, it becomes the china cabinet, it becomes the curio cabinet in our home, it becomes all of those things that give us joy to look at and that we might learn. And the idea of being a collector, as I said, touched on earlier, you might feel like you want every one, like, somebody might have like the Christmas plates with every year. You're not really satisfied if you're missing 1974 out of your collection. You're going to want that one. So I think it's a very human nature to collect things that are interesting to us and pretty to us and useful to us, but also want to collect all of it. Yeah.
Angela says, wonderful presentation. Thank you. Gail recommends a couple of museums that perhaps have these types of displays, the Fairbanks Museum in Vermont, and also the Bennington Museum in Vermont. Yeah, both museums have this type of display even today. Let's see,
I think
else?
that is a phenomenon that, as I said, I showed the one from Houston, but two in Houston, Natural History Museum and the Museum of Fine Arts. But yeah, I think it's a bit of a trend. And of course, Vienna and London as well, doing it is on a grand scale to return some of their galleries and some of their spaces to the ways that things looked several hundred years ago. It captures our imagination.
Let's see. So we're winding down here. Kristen says, so fascinating. Thank you. Gail says, Joseph Cornell's work is very similar to this idea and is worth checking out.
Yes.
Mark says that he has a built-in curio cabinet in his dining room that has glass doors. He thanks you for the fascinating presentation. And Diane says thank you as well. So Mary, why don't we sort of wrap it there as we approach noon? Do you have any last words for the group?
I don't. Thank you all for joining us today. And I look forward to seeing you again soon when we talk about the lives of the Impressionists.
Yes. So Thursday, March 10th, 4 weeks from this morning at 11 o'clock, Mary will be back. We also have a lot of other art history programs coming up, and I'll include those in the email later today. And I want to thank the Memorial Hall Library in Andover for partnering with us this morning. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks again, Mary.
Thanks a lot, Robert. Bye-bye, everybody.
See you next month. Bye-bye.
Bye.